Good morning. It's Kailash Tami today, and therefore I thought we'd do something Shivite. So with that in mind, this is a ShivLing. More specifically, it's my ShivLing. And with one potential exception out there in the audience, I don't think any of you thought you'd ever see my Lingam on camera. Now, as for why we're talking about this particular element today, it's not just because it's a very important element for Shivite piety and understanding. This being a Monday, of course, Lord Shiva's Day. It's also because, first and foremost, for our broader Indo-European sphere activities, this helps us to understand various elements in the more Western Indo-European spheres, the Nordic sphere, the Greek sphere, the Roman sphere. And also, just as importantly, it helps us to demonstrate, in part aided by those other spheres and how it all fits together, how something often derided as being non-Indo-European is actually very Indo-European indeed, that being the ShivLing we've just sort of met. So, without further ado, we shall get into it by examining a quote from the Roman sphere. Now, this is from a guy called St. Augustine, who I'm sure some of you will have heard of. Augustine was a Christian polemicist, to put it mildly, who made something of a business of taking elements from the pagan cultures he wanted to write against and presenting them in such a manner as to inflame the passions of his readership, to decide that the pagan ways were not good, not civilized, whatever you want to call it. And whether through his misunderstanding or potentially due to his agenda leading to perhaps a little less rigor when it came to reporting on some things, he had a bit of a habit of twisting some of these things to present the customs he was attacking in a rather negative manner. So, in this particular instance, he's taken something from a guy called Varro, who was writing in the 1st century BC, and he's presented it, well, I'll read the quote and you'll see what I mean. Open quotation marks. Among other rites which I am compelled to pass over due to their sheer number, there are certain rites of Liber that Varro says are celebrated at Italian crossroads with such shameful abandon that the private parts of the male are worshipped in their god's honour, and not even in secret, out of some deference to modesty, but openly and with wantonness running riot. Yes, indeed, during Liber's festal days, this disgusting member would be exhibited on a wagon with great honour, and carried first around the crossroads in the countryside, and then brought all the way into the city. In the town of Lavinium, they even dedicated a whole month to Liber, and during these days, they all used such disgraceful language until that member had been carried through the forum and had come to rest in its own place. Then the most respectable woman, a mother of a family, had to place a garland on said dishonourable member. In this way, supposedly, the God Liber was to be propitiated, so that all would turn out well with the seeds. In this way, the hex needed to be warded off the fields. That's from the City of God. That's the name of the Augustinian work in question. Now, unfortunately, we don't actually have the original Varro work that he's referencing there. It's, as with many things, lost in antiquity, and it survives only in these polemical borrowings which, make use of its corpse, we might sort of say. Now, there are a few points which we should pick up to explain why that quotation is where we've led in with. The first one is the identity of Liber, which, as you might assume, is rather linked to notions of freedom, liberty, that sort of thing. Somewhat, anyway. Liber is a sort of Roman, not quite sanitized, more sort of acceptable version of Dionysus. They had some, how shall I put this? Some, not disdain, but fearfulness for the sort of the uncontrolledness of Dionysus in an earlier age in Rome, but that's a matter for another time. The point is that Dionysus, as we all know from extensive work previously, is strongly coterminous with Lord Shiva of the Hindu sphere. Now, the second point we raised there is this point around bringing in a dishonourable member, as Augustine puts it. It's possible that he's actually slightly on the money with this. Slightly. Now, this ShivLing, which I'm holding in my hand here, Lingam in Sanskrit has a number of meanings, one of which is, in fact, member, well, marking of gender, we might sort of say, marking of the male gender, if you get my drift. However, it's not only that. People often make this horrendous mistake of assuming it's just that. It really isn't, even though it is one of the entirely legitimate interpretations of both the term and for some of the lingams in question. What it actually is, a lingam, a ShivLing, is an aniconic representation of Lord Shiva. It's a stone altar. We offer libations onto it. It's correlated with the axis mundi, the world axle, the axis around which the rest of the universe sort of turns. We'll get onto that when we cover the Nordic side of things. But the point is, it's often attacked by Christian missionaries and sort of British people of high breeding and such, like Lord Macaulay in the British Parliament, as being phallic, and we're phallus worshippers. Now, apart from the fact that in classical civilization, things like the Herms of Athens often had phallic representations on them, which were entirely respectable and to be protected and engaged with appropriately. As I say, it misses so much to reduce it down to just that one particular element of the interpretation of lingam, but it's a very useful thing for polemical purposes, so people often insistently do. Anyway, we should move on. The point is, in terms of what's going on there with these Liber festal days, we don't really have much in the the direct Roman theological corpus to really tell us directly what's going on with those members which are being sort of spoken of. How they're being worshipped, why they're being worshipped in such a way. Is Augustine making stuff up? He could be. What we do have, however, is this handy thing called the Hindu sphere and Comparative Indo-European theology, in which we can go, okay, so what we see with this over here matches up rather well with these Hindu elements, whereby, yes, we do garland ShivLings with ornate flower arrangements, etc., as an ordinary part of the rituals which we carry out. We may be invoking with the ShivLing in question the fecundity of the land, so that it actually does wind up producing things, and especially the dispelling of curses. It's all entirely normal and straightforward. And as we've said, Dionysus is Shiva, so it makes logical sense. So as you can see, we're immensely fortunate, lucky I would say, are both possible translations of Shiva as it happens. One of the pundits in my temple often translated Om Namah Shivaya as good luck, which is good idiomatic English. But we're quite fortunate to have this Hindu sphere that helps us to unlock what's going on over there with these Roman concepts fragmentarily attested. Now, it might be tempting to ask at this particular juncture how we can be sort of reasonably sure that when it comes to Liber or Dionysus, we're talking about, Shiva. Now, I've written extensively upon that subject, and I'm not going to get into it in great detail here, except to say that the notion of a god of ecstasy, and sort of dance and drama and wielding a spear and various other bits and pieces like that, is strongly resonant in both the Hellenic and Vedic, and Eddic was, of course, we shall see soon, Vedic sort of demesnes. When the Macedonians, the Greeks, went to India, they encountered certain places that were I suppose you might say, sacred to Shiva. There's some back and forth about the particular location of some of these, for example, the city of Nissa, which appears to possibly derive from a Shaivite theonym as one potential explanation for it. There are others. But the particular point I wish to pick up with regard to that is that in both Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca and Strabo's Geography, they both talk about these pillars which are in India. And these pillars are found as sort of structures used in worship wherever Dionysus, according to the Greek understanding of things, had been in India. Now, as I've said, Shaivite piety is significantly oriented around these ShivLings, which are in fact in the Linga Purana and other such sources directly stated to be not only obviously these fine stones, but also direct resonances with the Stamba victory pillar, Upastamba, the Stamba structures which we find in more archaic Vedic usage, or even can be found in the form of particular trees. So these pillars, which are correlated with where Dionysus is in India, are quite clearly talking about the Greeks encountering lingams, which were being used for Shaivite devotional purposes. It all sort of fits together. But we'll just sort of park that thought for a moment, and we'll move on to the Nordic sphere with one of the more interesting, to my mind, examples of a potential mythic resonancy or eternal return. Now, what I mean by those concepts, which are quite sort of ornate, often in ritual, what we're doing is we are reimmanentizing, we're bringing out into the world around us something which takes place in myth. The myth has the template, we do the thing out here to reduplicate the thing that's, so the benefit from the mythic action in question. We engage in the mythic action ourselves, if you will, to ensure the myth and its consequences continue to emanate and enrich the world around us. Now, as it happens, things kind of possibly go the other way around as well in the Nordic sphere, because so many of the Eddic texts come down to us from decades after Christianization. They didn't have a living tradition to go, okay, well, this is what we're reporting on. And they also, of course, had to get stuff past the radar, if you will, in terms of the Christian authorities. So we wind up with stuff that was a ritual understanding being sort of talked about in these mythic terms, as we've discussed previously with regard to the mead of poetry and the skeletal parmal and the havamal. In this particular instance, however, with the Eddic source material in question, the Voluspa material we're about to quote from would appear to be an authentic rendition. It's the Gylfaginning bit that sort of editorializes it, but more upon that in a moment. Now, to quote from the Voluspa, which is verse 19 in the Bellows translation, I think it is. "An ash I know, Yggdrasil its name, with water white is the great tree whet. Thence come the dews that fall in the dales. Green by earth's well, does it ever grow?" Now we'll then quote the Gylfaginning, which also quotes in slightly different translation that same Voluspa verse. "It is further said that these Norns who dwell by the well of Urdur take water of the well every day, and with it that clay which lies about the well, and sprinkle it over the ash, to the end that its limbs shall not wither nor rot. For that water is so holy, that all things which come there into the well become as white as the film which lies within the eggshell, as is here said. I know an ash standing, called Yggdrasil, a high tree sprinkled with snow-white clay. Thence come the dews in the dale that fall. It stands evergreen above Urdur's well. That dew which falls from it onto the earth is called by men honeydew, and thereon are bees nourished. 2 fowls are fed in Urdur's well. They are called swans. And from those fowls has come the race of birds which is so called." End quote. Now, in terms of what we see there, Yggdrasil, as we should be familiar with by now, is the axis mundi. There's also some reasonable grounds to believe that, as with other axis mundi structures in Indo-European myth, at least one deity, possibly two, is to be found almost as the axis mundi, that being the Sky Father and or his wife, depending upon which verse, which context, and which culture. This is quite directly attested when it comes to the Vedic sphere. There's inferential elements for it when it comes to the Hellenic sphere, and as with so many things in the Germanic or Nordic sphere, we're basically left putting 2 and 2 together and possibly getting, well, we hope it's an accurate number, but we'll see how things play out. Anyway, in terms of what's going on, what we have is the Ash-Nymphs, we might sort of say, carrying out libations of a white liquid onto the this axis mundi. And they are doing this in order to ensure its health, especially because it's being constantly gnawed upon by various demonic forces that are seeking to, to chaotically corrupt it and to bring it down. Now that's because this axis mundi is also the saliency of cosmic order within our universe. It's literally the linchpin of it, about which everything else sort of revolves. So you can see why those chaotic forces would want to have it to break into sunder. Because then, of course, all hell breaks loose quite literally. I believe that's called Ragnarok, with the all hell breaking loose and so on and so forth. But in terms of the white liquid that's being sort of utilized to maintain the bowels of Yggdrasil, and I note that other translation says snow white clay, so it's possibly a bit more of a less of a pure liquid and more of a not gelatinous substance, but kind of like butter, that sort of thing. It's a bit thicker. I believe that once again the Hindu sphere has an answer to explain what's going on here. You see, in ShivLing puja, which puja is basically sort of prayer or observance, the way in which we carry out the libations for our ShivLing, once again, fine ShivLing, not about our ShivLing, is we pour libations onto it. This is also, as of course people know, this is one of the etymologies for God, that which libations are poured to. The libations, in the case of the ShivLing, if you're going with the basic format, which is what we do most of the time, it's comprised of 1 round of water followed by 3 rounds of milk while chanting Om Namah Shivaya, followed by another round of water. That, as I say, is the basic version, but as you can see, there's a white liquid quite prominently associated with this. The more advanced versions involve various combinations of things which are brought into the libation, one of which is a substance I've often discussed called Panchamrit. Panchamrit means, Pancha means 5. You can see the cognate with pent and so on and so forth, and PF sound shift gets you to 5. The Amrit bit, I'm a Gujarati Mandar, so of course I say Amrit, but Amrit would be more sort of correct if we're going by the Sanskrit. So Panchamrit, Amrit, meaning opposite of, Mrit, of course, being cognate with Mort, Mort being death, so Amrit, immortality, like ambrosia, directly cognate, or nectar, figuratively cognate, which of course, you know, the thing the gods like to drink, ambrosia, nectar. That's why they're immortal. So of course, Amrit, Soma, same deal. You can see why it's very useful to be able to pour Amrit onto something which is in vital necessity of the healing and life-bestowing properties because it's under such constant assault by these demonic forces. Now, Panchamrit is made out of 5 ingredients, as you'd assume. Milk, as we've met, ghee, which is sort of clarified butter, which gives it some of that sort of thick consistency and a certain level of goldenness to it, and energy, vitally important. And also curd, which is effectively unsweetened yogurt. So additionally on that sort of that thickness, you can see how sort of yogurt, curd, and sort of clay might be sort of rather cognate in that sort of regard in terms of how they sort of come across. The other elements of jaggery, which is sugarcane, and honey. Honey, note that. Which of course it creates quite a sweet thing, which it's very good that the gods aren't vulnerable to diabetes, I'll put it that way, because it's incredibly sweet. I can barely sort of tolerate drinking too much of it because it, as I say, quite sugary. Anyway, the point is, these libations we carry out using Panchamrit, or milk. You can see how this quite strongly relates to what these Ash-Nymphs are carrying out with Yggdrasil in the Voluspa verses in question, in the Gylfaginning referencing of it. Especially because, if we pick up on that next part of the Gylfaginning referencing of it, to quote again, that dew which falls from it onto the earth is called by men honeydew. Now this is very interesting because what we see in the Western Indo-European sphere, in both this Nordic end of things and in the Hellenic, is a pretty consistent association of the ash tree with 2 things. In fact, 3 things, but we'll get on to the third one in a moment. The 2 things in question, the first one is spears. Ash trees are very good for spears. So you find guys called Eumeles and things like that in Greek poetry. It means the guy with a good spear. And of course, this shows up also in the Anglo-Saxon end of things and other Germanic bits and pieces, because the spear association of the ash tree is something which is continued even 1,000 years after the Greek verses which have come down to us. I've written about that somewhere else. We're not going to go into too much detail about that here, except to note that we are, of course, hailing the spear god. And by spear god, I, of course, mean both Odin, Gertir, and, of course, Lord Shiva, Shulapani, the guy who has a spear in his hand. Shouldn't call him a guy, but that's another matter. Purusha is, of course, a viable way to refer to Shiva. I suppose that does mean guy. Anyway, I digress. In terms of the other association, it's honey. Now, the word for honey in ancient Greek, sweetness, is it's things along the lines of mele, which interestingly is possibly something which has come into, well, not via ancient Greek, but via a Proto-Indo-European formulation, has turned up in ancient, Chinese, modern Chinese, to mean sort of sweetened things like that, sort of mei, things of that nature, side issue. The point is, there's a consistent doublet going on in ancient Greek for terms for the ash tree and terms for honey. The ash sap, so to speak, winds up effectively being something you find on the ash trees and which has that sweetness characteristic associated with it. Now, where this gets interesting is that third point of coterminity I talked about, the Ash-Nymphs, which show up, as we've just seen, nurturing Yggdrasil by pouring these libations, but also show up in the ancient Greek sphere of things, nurturing the infant Zeus and feeding him honey, that's to say the melee again, along with the milk of Amalthea, which is a sort of a, if I remember correctly, depending upon which version of Amalthea you're encountering, it's either sort of a quadruped that produces milk, as you might sort of probably presume, or it's another one of these nymphs, which is, well, the milk comes from the same part of the animal, but, sorry, not, the rather more anthropomorphic place where milk comes from, if you get my drift. I digress. It's rather early in the morning, I've been up all night. Anyway, the point is, we once again have these Ash-Nymphs carrying out these libations or offerings of milk and honey to the Skyfather deific. In that particular context, it's the young Zeus. And there's some other elements which we may get into at some future commentary about, the young Zeus and a stone sort of an ovular sort of shape that is used as a duplicate or a resonancy for that infant Zeus, which does in fact look rather like a ShivLing, but more upon that some other time. Where I'm going with all of this is quite simple. When we look at these mythic concepts which we find in the Nordic sphere, in the Greek sphere, and in the Roman sphere, we have something that resonates very strongly with what's found in everyday piety for us here in the Hindu sphere. That's that ShivLing puja I've just sort of talked about, featuring our good friend the ShivLing, which is, as we've just said, the Sky Father embodied. There's a bit more going on with this particular style of ShivLing. We'll touch upon that in a moment. Now, the reason why I've sort of belabored the point in explaining all of these things, apart from the fact that I often do that with the numerous digressions, is because when it comes to Shiva conceptry, we so often find people with a bit of a cottage industry and a bee in their bonnets, no honey reference intended, trying to say Shiva is a non-Indo-European deity. This is completely false. You go back to the Vedas and you find Rudra is very much Indo-European. You find all the characteristics of Lord Shiva in Lord Rudra. It's all right there. But of course, people want to believe, for various reasons, that Shiva is non-Indo-European. Either because they don't like Indo-Europeans, they want to have their deity which they like to worship, and there's some particular people with agendas who do that, or because they want to try and deride one of the most popular and deservedly prominent modern Hindu deities as being non-Indo-European, because they want to try and attack Hinduism as being non-Indo-European likewise. Now, it also occurs that that British man of higher breeding I talked about, Lord Macaulay, who was attacking Shaivism in the British Parliament. In fact, the guy literally said, as a matter of imperial policy, the British Empire should favour the Mohammedan over the Brahmanical religion. And of course, specifically, when he was upbraiding the Lord in question who he was sort of attacking, he said that if he was forced to choose a Hindu denomination, this Lord Macaulay, he'd much prefer to be a Vaishnava rather than a Shaivite, which amuses me greatly in a rather sad way. But that is another matter for another time. I've covered it extensively elsewhere. The reason why I've talked so much about these other forms of Indo-European mythic observance, or in the case of that Liber observance, an observance we don't quite understand because it's been sort of bowdlerized in its presentation by a polemicist, is because they strongly resonate with what we have here in the Hindu sphere with these ShivLings, with Lord Shiva. It would therefore seem very peculiar indeed if such a close resonancy was the result of mere happenstance or accident or isolated coincidence. I believe quite strongly that these are archaic Indo-European understandings carried forward in multiple directions by the respective bearer peoples. It's just that it's only here in the Hindu sphere that we've actually been able to keep these things alive. And so therefore, when we start talking about Irminsuls, which is the other point which I should probably raise, the Irmin, of course, as people know, is often identified with Odin. Sul has a bit of a complex etymology, we'll leave it for some other time. But the idea of these sacred trees, or these sacred posts, to which, once again, libations are poured unto, we're looking at the same basic concept as what we see with the ShivLing, especially if it's one of the wooden post-style ones that you also see in more archaic usage. So, very Indo-European indeed. Now, in order to close, I want to talk about this particular form of glorious lingam. Now, it's in a fine, we'll demonstrate something interesting here. The actual the housing for the ShivLing, well, this is what it looks like. And if the ShivLing goes into it, as you can sort of see, well, yes, there is something which this may perhaps remind you of, perhaps. I shouldn't be handling it with my left hand, I do apologize. Anyway, the reason why this particular form of Shivaling is special is because it is a Lingam, or a Narmada Lingam. Narmada is the river which it comes from. These are self-manifested images, well, resonancies, if you will, embodiments of Lord Shiva. They're not carved by human hands. They're self-manifested by his divine will in the currents of the river. Therefore, unlike with many other sort of forms of murti or divine representation, whereby at the start of a rite we need to invoke the god into the representation so that they are present for our offerings, a Narmada Lingam, a Bana Lingam, is quite different. Shiva is always in it. He's always there. This is partially why they're so powerful and so sought after. No avahanam, no asanam required. He's already there. However, he's not alone in there. Now, as you can see, there are two colours to this particular lingam. The lower half is a sort of a stony, quartzite sort of colour. I forget the precise form of rock. The upper one, however, is actually a blood red. Well, actually, it's more the iron of blood, we might sort of say. It's actually meteoric iron, apparently. The lower part, although you can hold it either way up with regard to a Narmada Lingam, so I'm told by my Brahminical associates, the part which is lower when I'm holding it like this, that's Lord Shiva. The iron blood-coloured meteoric iron, that is Shakti, Devi. So inside this Narmada Lingam, we find both Shiva and Devi, both Shiva and his Shakti. That is partially why they're so powerful, that is partially why they're so resonant, because both of the divine couple are already there in this particular stone, which is also, as we've discussed, the axis mundi and other things of their particular nature. A glorious thing. It's incredible. Well, it's very dear to me for obvious reasons, and I'm very grateful to have come into its possession through that particular form of divine intervention, known as good comrades. You know who you are. Anyway, I've written about the Narmada Lingam or Bana Lingam sort of understanding in greater detail elsewhere, so we're not going to sort of try and go through all of that at this particular junction. The point is, as we've said, the Axis Mundi, you can often find either the Skyfather or his wife, or possibly both, housed in situ within it. It is a resonancy of cosmic order out here in this world of ours. Actually, resonancy is not quite the right word. Saliency, a point of emanation, however you want to phrase it. And therefore, we carry out these rites of Shivling Puja, or these other rites which are obviously attested mythically or otherwise. Not just in the general sense of, so we want to please the god, we want to ask for particular boons and things, they're also very much that. But also because, as it is a salient of cosmic order, Rita or Orlog within our universe, we are acting just as those Ash-Nymphs do for Yggdrasil, to protect, uphold, and to maintain that cosmic order within our universe. Of course, it is a righteous action, a lawful action, a divine action, a mandated action, manu action in some ways, to be carrying out sort of proper acts of piety in a general sense. But that additional layer to it, that additional vitality, is why I think it's vitally important for us to explore these kinds of things and be able to resurrect these more westerly Indo-European understandings, which are directly cognate and directly correlate with the Hindu understanding which I've just briefly extolled for you earlier this morning. So, there you have it. A Shivling, Indo-European piety, also understood by the Ash-Nymphs of the Nordic sphere, and of course the Hellenic sphere, and also attested in the worshipful practices of the classical Indo-Europeans as well. Very Indo-European indeed, as somebody else would possibly say. Om Namah Shivaya. Jai Sri Rudra.